Good evening, everyone. This is our presentation, the Western art, specifically in the prehistoric period. This is presented by Padilla Nikiros and Bairat Aliana Jan. To start off, art appeared as one of the earliest activities of man, even as far back as the prehistoric period. Before man knew how to read and write, he was already an artist. The first works of art were found inside the caves which primitive man inhabited. Paintings of animals on the walls and ceilings, as well as the first works of sculpture.
So next is the cave painting. So painting along with sculpture is the most ancient of the arts, where the archaeologists have discovered many cave paintings in the southwestern France and the northern Spain to be old as 40 years and more. So how did painting begin? So the primitive man in his struggle for survival in the old Stone Age depended on the hunting wild animals for food and clothing. So the world was a mystery to him, and he tried to explain its phenomena by magic. So at first, he would press his palm open and fingers on the walls of his cave and trace their outlines as testimony of his presence or as his mark and signature of the physical world. So later on, with two fingers, he would form macaroni-like figures of wild animals of the hunt. So early man believed that by portraying animals on the wall, he would have mastery over them in reality. So this sympathetic magic would guarantee successful hunting. So the cave paintings reached a high degree of perfection in the examples at the Lascaux, France. So the application of natural pigments became very subtle and skillful, and line developed a flexibility and expressiveness which suggested the movement of the hunt and the qualities of the animals themselves. So there were also indications and drawings of arrows and spears in the pursuit of the vainly fleeing animals. So in Altamira, Spain, modeling was used with skill, and the artist even suited his figures to the protuberances and hollows of the surface for a three-dimensional effect. And these paintings of high artistic quality and remarkable naturalism attest to the trained hunter's eye and the keen powers of observation.
For the sculpture, it was through the same belief in magic that sculpture came to be. The first works of sculpture, aside from small animal statues, were the fertility statues, so called because of their exaggerated treatment of the female sexual attributes. The artist emphasized the opulent breasts and the wide hips, but took no note of the face, thus showing no individualizing qualities. Some were in low relief, such as the Venus of Lausel. Some were in the round, such as the Venus of Willendorf. Because of the rigorous climate and the precarious conditions of existence in the Pleistocene age, early man feared his own extinction. As the mammoths of the cold, the dinosaurs, and the giant reptiles had become extinct. To forestall this grim possibility, he produced fertility statues in the belief that they would ensure him of many offspring and the continuance of his species.
So next is the beginning of the architecture. So early man with his nomadic existence in search of animals to hunt for food and clothing did not build permanent dwellings, but they lived in caves and natural shelter. So the first notions he had of building came when he began the practice of burying his dead. So this occurred with the development of the social organization. So at first, the early man arranged the gravestones to form some kind of primitive religious symbolism. So the first structures are the menhirs, the dolmens, and the cromlech. So these were associated with a funeral and religious purpose. So the menhirs found along the coastlines of Europe and Africa. So these were simple monuments consisting of a single large piece of stone, a megalith, and this sometimes rising as high as 60 feet. So this is also believed that the primitive man erected them as shelter for spirits of those lost at sea. So next is the dolmens. So these are made up of a number of vertical megaliths with a horizontal slab spanning them. So there were primitive graves to accommodate a number of dead. So they are important structurally as the beginning of the post and lintel system. And next is the cromlech. So these are complex structures, again made up of a number of megaliths in concentric circles extending over a wide area. So the most interesting example of the cromlech is the famous Stonehenge in the Salisbury Plain in England. So its structure suggests that it may have been the scene of ancient religious rites, culminating in a human sacrifice. So it was also served as a huge calendar which marked the equinox of the year by the position of the sun's rays upon the structure, and this could also foretell the occurrence of the lunar and solar eclipses, which have been the momentous events to the early man. So the astonishing mathematical precision of this structure has been recently proven by computer.
In the river civilizations, about 10,000 BC, with the end of the fourth glacial period and the onset of warmer weather throughout the world, man migrated in search of geographical conditions more advantageous to existence. The first human settlements grew along the banks of rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile in Egypt, and the farther east, the Yangtze River in China, and the Indus and Ganges River in India. The mode of existence shifted from a hunting, nomadic, and day to day economy to agriculture and domestication of animals, which encouraged a more stable social structure leading to barter, trade, and accumulation of surplus. Later, trade through, spread out into the Mediterranean, and the first seaports became bustling centers of cultural and economic exchange. Soon, the first writing systems were invented, such as the cuneiform writing of the Phoenicians, a seafaring people, and became disseminated in the course of their economic activities. In Mesopotamia, by the twin rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates arose the kingdoms of Sumeria and Babylonia. A more stable socio-economic structure based on agriculture paved the way to the centralization of powers in a despot who enforced his rule by conquest and established a dynasty until its overthrow by a stronger rival. The first codes of law were drawn up, the most famous of which was the Code of Hammurabi, with its principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The ruler, who claimed divine origin, mobilized the people, especially the slaves, to build palaces and temples in his glory. In Babylonia, known for its famous Tower of Babel, was erected the ziggurat, a tower-like structure which strove to reach the skies. Sculpture was generally associated with the religious function, and the statues of the gods and the rulers were representative, that is, in a rigid frontal positions. All the arts were in the service of religion and the glory of the ruler.
So next is the Egyptian art. So the ancient Egypt, which grew along the banks of the Nile, branching out into the fertile delta of the lower Egypt and emptying into the Mediterranean, was one of the earliest and important agricultural civilizations. So the beginning of its history is marked at about 3000 BC, and with its simple beginning geography based on sharp contrast, the fertile river banks with the linear disposition of cities along the Nile are flanked by the arid desert on both sides. So Egypt for a long period was under the centralized rule of a pharaoh, which is the Great House. So these are the dynasties of which mark the periods of the Egyptian history.
In the religious function, the art of ancient Egypt was closely knit with religion. And to understand it, we must realize that at its very core is a profound preoccupation with death and immortality. The basic religious scripture was the Book of the Dead with its funeral prayers and ritual. Among the ancient Egyptians, deities were Ra, the sun god and the source of energy, who is perpetually renewed at sunrise; Osiris, the god of the underworld, who goes through several deaths and resurrections; Isis, his loyal and ever watchful wife; and Ma'at, the goddess of truth, who weighs who weighs a man's heart against a feather. The spirit of a man was Ka, residing in the body, and it was of utmost importance to provide it with shelter after that to ensure its continued existence. It was therefore necessary to preserve the image of the dead in painting and sculpture and to actually preserve his remains in mummification. It was in accordance with this belief that the Egyptians devoted more time and effort into the building of the tombs than into the construction of the dwellings. The earlier and simpler type of tomb was the mastaba, a chamber for the dead. This later developed with the addition of several levels into the stepped pyramid, such as such as that of Saqqara.
So next is the pyramid. So the great pyramids of the kings, especially that of King Khufu, were the highest point of pyramid construction. So the largest built on a base of 13 acres and rose to about 450 feet. So the huge stones, each weighing from 2.5 to 30 tons, were quarried from Upper Egypt and transported for miles in the desert. So the sides of the pyramid were oriented to the four directions, and the precision of their construction is a marvel even to our day. So the wonders of the pyramids are not confined to their exterior within. So the chambers of the royal dead were spacious apartments with interconnecting corridors. So the treasures of the pharaoh were kept, and gold and jewelry along the implements of everyday activity. So the king's mummy was concealed beneath several layers of gold and silver, which also doubled as full-length images of the pharaoh, garbed in all the emblems of his state. So all around the walls were paintings of the king surrounded by his family and in the company of Osiris, Isis, and the other deities. And the paintings of these personages were in the linear geometric style of the court painters. So with the face in profile having a fully delineated eyes and the shoulders in frontal position. So however, false other animals and plants were given a more spontaneous naturalistic treatment.
In the temples, it is also in the ancient Egyptian temples that the visual arts, the painting, the sculpture, and the architecture found fullest expression. The temples shared the massive quality of the pyramids. Some were constructed on the sides of a cliff, such as that of Queen Hatshepsut and the temple at Abu Simbel. Others, such as that of Luxor and Karnak, were of the pylon type. Egyptian architecture developed the use of the post and lintel system. It also made extensive use of columns with lotus and papyrus motifs. The temple of Hatshepsut consisted of two galleries of columns on two levels connected by an inclined ramp. That of Abu Simbel displayed gigantic seated statues of Ramses II in the typical rigid presentive stance. while the figures of subordinates in between them were disproportionately small, attesting to the rigid social hierarchy prevailing. The temples of Luxor and Karnak had pylon facades made of a huge stone rectangle with sloping sides divided in the center for the entrance. The large stone structure had a few small apertures in its upper section. Before the facade was an obelisk, a tall and a slender monolith with four sides culminating in a small pyramid at the top. The obelisk was inscribed with hieroglyphic characters recording the deeds of the pharaoh. It was flanked by giant statues of the pharaohs in standing position, heads slightly raised and seeming to gaze into the distance, fist clenched at the side and one foot forward. Sometimes, as in the temple of the Karnak, a long avenue of sphinxes, half man and half beast creatures, led to the pylon. Beyond the massive and forbidding facade, into which only the high priests could enter, were the interconnecting galleries of huge columns inscribed with hieroglyphics. The forest of columns became darker as one approached the sanctuary chamber, where the large statue of the pharaoh was kept. These statues, as well as many others of its kind, served to perpetuate the image of the pharaoh in case of the dissolution or destruction of the mummified body. At daybreak, the high priest would anoint, clothe, dress, and symbolically feed the statue to prepare it for its revivification with the first rays of the sun. Thus was Egyptian art primarily religious in nature. Painting and sculpture had as principal function the preservation of the image of the dead so as to assure the continued survival of the spirit, and the architecture, the construction of a secure and impenetrable shelter for the ka. The artistic style underwent little modification in long course of the dynasties because of the value given to immutability, and permanence, and because art itself associated with the pharaonic court was inextricably bound with religious convention. That is all po. Thank you.